I welcome you all to the module 6 of this course. So, the module 6 is about behaviorism and learning perspective and how this perspective explains human personality. So, this module has two lectures. Today we will have the first lecture and overall this is the lecture number 12. So, this is the first part of this module which talks about how behaviorism is connected to the concept of personality. And in this lecture, we will be more specifically talking about the concept of classical conditioning and how it connects to personality. So, before we talk about today's lecture, we will just give you a brief recap of last lecture that we discussed. So, last lecture was lecture number 11 and that was a part of psychoanalysis. The second part of psychoanalysis, the lecture included the concepts related to psychoanalysis. In that lecture, we discussed the concept of anxiety and how the ego part of our personality deals with anxiety, particularly using defense mechanism. So, we discussed the diverse defense mechanisms or strategies that people use in day to day functioning in terms of coping with anxiety and stressful situations. We also discussed psychosexual stages of development as proposed by Sigmund Freud, where we talked about the different stages that Freud talked about from birth of a child to adolescence. The different stages that we talked about and what are the characteristics, what are the possibilities of fixation into the different stages and how this fixation could impact the adult personalities and so on. We also discussed the various criticism associated with psychoanalysis as psychoanalysis has a huge impact and popularity in terms of the theory, not only just within psychology, even beyond psychology, but this theory has also invited a lot of criticism because of the methodology it uses and various controversial concepts. We also at the end discussed the concept of Neo-Freudians, where we talked about a group of disciples or who are once followers of Freud, but they later departed and kind of extended the Freud theories and few more additions that they did in the psychoanalysis. So, who are called as Neo-Freudians, and we discussed some of the basic ideas of all the Neo-Freudians. We have not looked into specific theories of Neo-Freudians. So, these were the few things that we discussed in the last lecture. So, today we will be talking about, as we have already said that this is a new module and we will be talking about the concept of behaviorism and learning perspective and how it connects to the concept of personality. And more specifically, today we will be talking about the Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning. We will understand the basic principles of classical conditioning and we will see how this can be connected to the concept of personality and some of the therapies that are popular in the behavioral tradition. So, let us start today's lecture. So, school of behaviorism was very dominant in the initial 20th century. This approach challenge some of the existing principles of many personality theories. If you look at trait theories and other theories that we talked about or some of the other theories that we will be talking after this module, most of these theories talks about some internal trait, existence of internal traits, tendencies, defenses, motivations that are there within the human personality, within the human system. Behaviorism as a school of thought, they were not at all interested into the internal conflicts and dynamics of human beings. They are more interested into how environmental factors shape human behavior. So, they are completely focusing on the behavioral part of it, how external factors influences our behavior, because they said to be truly scientific investigation should only focus on those aspects which are visible, which can be measured in the outside world. So, they are focusing only mostly on the factors which influences human behavior, particularly the environmental factors. So, behaviorists argue that internal concepts are irrelevant, So, they did not deny completely the existence of such factors, but they said these are not necessary to explain human behaviors and personality. We can explain human behavior from the impact of environment on human behavior, impact of stimulus from the outside. So, they believe that individuals are entirely shaped by their environments and that behavior is determined by external stimuli reinforcement rather than by the internal processes. So, their focus was more on external factors and how the kind of environment that we live in, how they shape our behavior and our personality, and not at all focusing on internal factors. So, behaviorism as a school of thought in psychology, they were very scientific in their approach, and they are very different from the other personality theories, which typically focuses on the internal factors and other things. Their main focus was how to scientifically study, how to measure very specifically and those kind of things. So, the approach and measurement and the methodology of behaviorism was so strictly scientific, and these particular characteristics separated them from a lot of other schools of thoughts. So, some of the assumptions of behaviorism is that one of the first assumption is that behavior should be explained by the causal influence of the environment on the person. So, every behavior, the causes of different behaviors can be located in the environment or in the outside situations, and should be explained by those causal factors in the outside environment. If you see a lot of other theories like psychoanalysis that we discussed in the last module, they are focusing exclusively on the internal factors and not just typical internal factors, but that too in the unconscious aspects of the mind. So, focus was completely different. So, behaviorists emphasize the role of external environmental factor in determining behavior. So, this is one of the basic assumptions of this school of thought. Second is that understanding of people should be based entirely on controlled laboratory research, which can involve both humans and animals. So, behaviorists were very much focused on the methodology part, and they were mostly interested into laboratory research, proper experimental research, and finding at the causes and the factors that are responsible for behavior, particularly what are the factors that determine behavior. And they also use lot of animal studies in their approach, and then they generalized those models, animal models, to the human models. So, because the lot of the basic behaviors they said could also be understood from the animal behavior. So, if you see the other personality theories, they predominantly studied human subjects. They most of the other paradigm they did not study animals. Behaviorism often builds its theories on research involving animals using strategy common in the science of study of simple systems of animals. So, they started with the simple systems of animals, how they learn, and then they moved into explaining human behavior. So, these are two major characteristics of behaviorism as a school of thought, which differentiate this school of thought from all the other schools of thoughts and the theories of personality. So, today we will be talking about one particular approach within the behaviorism, which is called classical conditioning. So, it is a part of behaviorist school of thought, one particular paradigm of learning, which is called classical conditioning. And this particular paradigm was kind of developed or founding father of this particular concept of classical condition is one of the Russian physiologist whose name was Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov studied animals, particularly dogs, and their behavior, and accidentally actually he was doing research with the dogs, physiological systems of the dogs, and accidentally he came up and found this concept of classical conditioning, which is in the domains of behavior. So, we will see what is this concept of classical conditioning and how it relates to the concept of personality. So, the classical conditioning is basically it is a process of learning. So, we learn things in varieties of ways. As a human or also animals learns lot of things. So, there are many ways we can learn things. One of the ways we learn things including animals is through classical conditioning. So, what is this classical conditioning is all about? So, it is a fundamental learning process first described by Ivan Pavlov, which involves forming association between stimuli and response. So, how we learn here? We learn here by associating two things, one is stimulus and the response, whatever response we respond to a stimulus. So, there is a stimulus and there is a response. So, we learn many things by associating them together. So, we'll try to understand this by a lot of examples also in this condition. So, lot of our learnings are actually learning by association. So, we connect two things one with the other, and whenever one comes we predict that other will also come, because they always come together. So, this learning by association of two things, and particularly in this context it's stimuli and response, is typically the paradigm of classical conditioning is all about. So, some of the key terms that we should understand before we explain the experiment that Ivan Pavlov did, which led to the concept of classical conditioning. So, we need to understand few basic terms. So, one term that we should understand is called as an unconditioned stimulus. Okay. So, unconditioned stimulus is basically a naturally and automatically triggers a response without any prior learning. So, any stimulus that whenever it is presented to a subject, it will automatically trigger a response. So, that is the means unconditioned. So, there is no need of condition, it is a natural stimuli. Whenever it is presented, there will be a natural response to that. So, if you present that stimulus, there will be a natural response to this. So, such stimuli are called as an unconditioned stimulus. Example, because we will be giving examples in the case of dog, because the experiment is with the dog. So, that we will understand and connect with the experiment in much better way. For example, if you present food, or let us say in case of dog it is a meat or meat powder, it will naturally cause dog to salivate. So, dog, if you present any food that is liked by a dog, that is a meat powder or something like that, dog will automatically salivate, or saliva will come out of the mouth of the dog. So, it is a natural response. So, the presence of the food stimulates a response in the dog, that is the stimulation of saliva in the mouth. Okay. So, it is a unconditioned stimulus. What is unconditional stimulus here? Food. Food is an unconditional stimulus in this context of setting of dog. Okay. So, this is one concept. So, it is a natural triggering response, any stimuli which naturally automatically trigger some response. So, that is a unconditional stimulus. Next comes a neutral stimulus. Neutral stimulus is any stimulus that initially does not trigger any particular response. So, if we call a stimulus as neutral response, that means it will not stimulate any response. So, if you present a neutral stimulus, then it will not have any impact, or it will not stimulate any response. So, then it is called as a neutral stimulus. So, in the context of dog, let us say, so because we are giving examples in the context of dog, so we will carry on with the same example. So, let us say if you present a sound of bell, or let us say we light a bulb, generally the dog will not respond in any specific ways. Sound of a bell, let us say it is not too loud or something like that. If you just present some sound, dog will not have any impact on the dog. So, dog will not respond in any particular way, because it does not cause any kind of response. So, in this case, sound of a bell will be a neutral stimulus. Okay. So, one is unconditioned stimulus, one is neutral stimulus. Then comes third category of stimulus called as conditioned stimulus. Now, in conditioned stimulus happens only when after association of two things. So, what happens whenever a neutral stimulus, previously neutral, because it was not stimulating any response. So, it was a neutral stimulus in the natural setting. When it is repeatedly paired or associated with an unconditional stimulus, the neutral stimulus begins to trigger a conditioned response. So, a neutral stimulus in general it will not stimulate any response, but when this stimulus is associated with an unconditional stimulus, in this case we discussed food. So, when and neutral stimulus in this case what we discussed is sound of a bell. So, let us say when sound of a bell is associated with food and presented. So, sound of a bell, food, after sound of a bell food is presented to the dog. So, what is happening here? A neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditional stimulus, then it will, because when food is presented the dog will respond in terms of producing saliva in the mouth. Okay? Now, when it is paired again and again repeatedly, after some time the just sound of a bell will stimulate a new response which was not there earlier, that is saliva will come out of the mouth of a dog. So, it will stimulate saliva production simply because the dog learned a new thing, that sound of a bell means food is going to come. So, and the saliva will automatically come into the mouth. So, earlier this sound of a bell was not producing any response, particularly this production of saliva, but when it is presented with unconditioned stimulus which is a food, then because of its association dog learned a new response, that is in the presence of or sound of a bell produce saliva in the mouth of the dog. So, it is a newly learned response which is called as a, so conditioned stimulus is here, earlier neutral stimulus, when it is paired with the unconditional stimulus it becomes conditioned stimulus. So, similarly, there are two kind of responses, one is unconditioned response. So, here basically a natural automatic reaction to the unconditional stimulus. So, here production of saliva when food is produced is unconditioned response. So, here response, so when you produce a food, so there is saliva in the mouth of the dog. So, that is called as the saliva production in the presence of food is unconditioned response. So, there is you do not have to do anything, it is a natural response. Conditioned response is coming from here, conditioned stimulus se idhar aa raha hai, it is coming from here. So, it is a learned response, the newly learned response which occurs after association has been made. So, when saliva is produced in response to the sound of bell, so it is a newly learned response, then that saliva production in response to sound of a bell is a conditioned response. Okay. So, these are the main terms that we need to understand when we talk about classical conditioning. So, in case of Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning, so we will see what kind of experiment he did. So, although learning theory primarily developed in the US, it was significantly because of this Pavlov's theory, who was a Russian physiologist, and he actually shaped this whole learning theories. In the earlier 20th century, Pavlov studied basically digestive systems of the humans and animals to observe salivary response of dogs. So, he was interested into physiological response, he was not interested into this behavioral and psychological thing. He discovered this accidentally. So, he noticed that dog would automatically salivate when given food, a naturally occurring response he termed the unconditioned stimulus, as we already discussed, triggered by the unconditioned stimulus which is the food. So, and then he found that when neutral stimulus is paired like light or bell of a sound, when it was preceded before the food, the dog would eventually salivate in response to light or bell alone. So, he discovered this accidentally actually. So, this process where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with the unconditional stimulus to elicit a conditioned response is known as classical conditioning. So, this process of associating with two things here in this particular context, a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and then there is a conditioned response happens, a newly response happens as a result of association. So, that is called as a classical conditioning. So, this whole paradigm is called as a classical conditioning. So, Pavlov's extensive research in this area provided the foundation for classical conditioning, which also is a learning paradigm. So, because we learn lot of things by associating like this. So, this is the paradigm. So, what is happening initially? Natural response before conditioning happens, food is presented to the dog. So, food is unconditional stimulus as we already discussed. Okay. So, the response dog salivates, it is a natural response, food presented, dog salivates. Okay. So, there is a unconditional stimulus, then there is a unconditioned response. Let us say the neutral stimulus here is light or sound of bell, whatever it is, in both the cases it works. So, light is switched on, so it is a neutral stimulus, there is no response. Okay. So, this is the first step in the research, what it does. In case of unconditioned stimulus, there is an unconditioned response. In case of neutral stimulus, there is no response. Okay. Now, in the conditioning procedure for several trials, light is switched on or bell sound in some cases, and then food is presented. So, light, food, So, what is happening? Neutral stimulus plus unconditioned stimulus, both are associated together, then obviously dog salivates because food is also presented. So, and response here is still unconditioned response, because still the dog is producing saliva because of the presence of dog, even though both are paired, but dog is responding with saliva because of presence of food only. So, again here response is still unconditioned response. Now, after this pairing again and again many times, the third step of conditioning, what happens? Light alone or bell alone is presented. Now, in this case food is not presented here, only light is presented without association with the dog, association with the food. So, this is conditioned stimulus because it creates a new response. Now, dog also salivates here without presentation of the food, because dog learned a new thing, because if sound of bell or light means food is going to come, that expectation, that association, that conditioning has happened in the mind of dog. So, this is called as a conditioned response when the dog salivates in response to bell or sound or light, whatever it is, which was a neutral response. So, now this third step is conditioned response. So, it is a new response, it is a newly learned response. So, in figure way we can see it just like this. So, presence of food, saliva is produced. So, this is kind of unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. This is unconditioned situations, both unconditional stimulus and unconditioned response. Now, if you present just bell, dog will not respond anything. So, this is a neutral situation, neutral stimuli. Okay. Bell doesn't have any impact on the dog as such. So, this is neutral. Now, when this neutral is associated with food, so bell, then food is presented, because by saying the food, the dog salivates. So, this pairing is done many times. So, then after many pairing, when just bell is sound of bell is produced, the dog salivates. So, this is a newly learned response called conditioned response. This is conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. From unconditioned stimulus response to conditioned stimulus and response, that is the journey of classical conditioning. So, this is how the dog learned a new response. So, this is a learning paradigm. So, new learning has happened. Now this is a case of dog. Now, what are the examples of classical conditioning in human life? We also learned many things through the process of classical conditioning. Lot of these fear responses that human being experiences, lot of fears are actually lot of them are actually classically conditioned responses. So, we learn lot of fears and lot of emotions through classical conditioning. For example, a person who has experienced a traumatic event such as in a car accident might develop a fear response when hearing the sound of screeching tires. Okay. So, let us say a person is not afraid of driving or sound of screeching tires. Naturally, generally any human being will not be afraid of this kind of things. But let us say a person meets with an accident while driving a car, he might develop a new response which was not there earlier. That is, let us say he might just fear sound of screeching tires can stimulate a fear response. Why this is stimulating? Earlier it was not creating any fear response. Now, just sound of screeching tires or even driving again could stimulate lot of fear in responses within that person. Now, what is happening here? It is a typical case of classical conditioning. So, initially the sound of screeching tires, it was a neutral stimulus. No one generally is afraid of sound of screeching tires for any person. So, it is a neutral stimulus. It is not creating any particular response within the person. It does not elicit any fear. So, it is a neutral stimulus here before the accident. However, during the accident, the sound of screeching tire, which is an unconditional stimulus in case of accident, because now this screeching tire was there during the accident accident time. So it was paired with the fear, because during the accident the lot of fear response was already there. So, this fear was associated with that sound of screeching tire, because during that accident lot of screeching tires of that sound was there in that environment. So, the person fear was associated with those sounds. And now what is happened with the fear of anxiety of the accident? When this accident happened, after some conditioning, because of the intensity of the event, even one accident could create a very strong association. The sound of screeching tire now becomes a conditioned stimulus. Earlier it was not creating any fear response. Now, after the accident, because this sound of screeching tire got associated with fear of accident, now just whenever you hear that sound of screeching tower, it will automatically stimulate all this fear response, which was there during the accident. It will elicit fear response, and even in the non-threatening situation, not necessarily all the time screeching tire is associated with accident. Even non-accidental situation also, this sound could create fear response, simply because it was earlier associated with something dangerous. So, this is a newly learned response, fear response, that happened typically because of the classical conditioning. We also develop lot of taste aversions through classical conditioning. For example, someone who gets food poisoning after eating, let us say some item, let us say eating sushi or something, like whatever, any item, after eating that food, because of certain reasons or some poisoning or whatever it is, you develop certain stomach ache or nausea or whatever it is. Now, before this incident, that particular food of sushi was a neutral stimulus, you used to like, and whatever it is, there was no disliking about that particular food item. When the person eats sushi and then experiences nausea and vomiting due to the food poisoning, now it was not because of the sushi, but because of something that is around the cooking of that, some poisoning might have happened, and after eating sushi you started feeling nausea and vomiting due to food poisoning. So, in this case it is an unconditioned stimulus and it resulted into illness, which is an unconditioned response. Okay. So, food poisoning will lead to illnesses. So, it is an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response. Now, a neutral thing was associated with that, which is sushi, which used to, let us say, like, or there was no problem while eating this particular food. Now, it got associated with this food poisoning thing. Now, after this event, the person might feel nausea at the mere sight of smell of sushi, even if the sushi is perfectly safe to eat. This learned aversion can extend to other foods with a similar texture or smells, demonstrating generalization. Now, after this incidence of food poisoning, just the moment you see this particular food again, you will feel that whole nausea and vomiting coming up. So, that is triggering those response which was associated earlier with that particular incident. Now, in this condition, it is safe to eat sushi, still you will not be able to eat, simply because it was associated with those sense of nausea and vomiting was which was associated with food poisoning, which happened in one particular case. People may sometimes also generalize anything that looks like sushi, they may not be able to eat again, or at least for some time, because of this classical conditioning. So, lot of this taste aversion, many times people used to love some food and then after some incident they are not able to, they cannot withstand the smell of those food and other things. So, such kind of taste aversion also can happen because of classical conditioning. So, some of the other processes that happens in classical conditioning is like generalization. So, it basically means generalization occurs when a conditioned response is elicited by stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus, even if the stimuli were never paired with the unconditioned stimuli. So, generalization means, for example, in case of dog, sound of a bell produced saliva because it was associated with food. Now, not only the sound of a bell, many similar other sound, not just the particular bell, but many other similar sound even if produced, that will also stimulate saliva production. So, that is called generalization. Similar things will get associated, and they will become conditioned stimuli. For example, in this case, if dog is conditioned to salivate to the sound of a bell, it might also salivate to similar sounds like sound of chime or different types of bell, even if those sounds were never directly associated with food. Because dog learned to generalize, similar sound means similar thing is going to happen. So, sometimes in certain cases of classical conditioning, this generalization could happen, where similar stimuli also elicit the similar response. Now, sometimes discrimination can also happen, where which is kind of opposite to generalization. What happens here? Discrimination is the ability to differentiate between conditioned stimulus and other stimulus that have been paired with, not been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. This means that conditioned response occurs only to that particular specific stimulus and not to the similar stimulus. So, in case of generalization, similar stimuli also will elicit responses, but in case of discrimination, no other even similar responses or stimulus, sorry, not responses, similar stimuli will not elicit responses. Only that particular stimuli which was associated with the particular situation will only create that responses. For example, in this case, if a dog is conditioned to salivate on the sound of a specific bell, it only will salivate only to that specific bell and not to other kind of sounds like chime or different types of bells and so on. So, sometimes discrimination could be also seen in many cases of classical conditioning. In some cases, generalization also could happen depending on many factors. So, both the processes can happen in the case of classical conditioning. Extinction can also happen. Obviously, whenever you learn a new response, it is not like it may not be permanent if you do not feed that particular response again and again. So, after sometimes if those pairing is not done, then the response will become weaker and weaker and may get also extinct. So, extinction is basically occurs when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus, leading to a gradual weakening and eventual disappearance of the conditioned response. So, for example, if the sound of the bell is repeatedly presented to the dog without following with food, now after few pairing the dog learned to respond to the sound of a bell. Now, again after that, let us say the bell is presented again and again and again without food for many time, the dog will also again learn a new thing, then that the bell is not going to produce food. So, the dog slowly this saliva response will become weaker and weaker and ultimately it will completely extinct. So, that is called extinction process. Now, sometimes there could be also spontaneous recovery, which basically means spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of the previously extinguished conditioned response after a period of rest. So, when the new learned response get extinct because it is not paired with the unconditioned stimulus, then sometimes let us say after few days again you produce the sound of bell, suddenly that spontaneous recovery, the dog will start producing saliva. So, it was not completely forgotten, it was there, but it became dormant, but after few days again when the sound of bell the dog hears, saliva may be produced by the dog. So, that is called spontaneous recovery. So, for example, here after the conditioned response to the bell has been extinguished because it was not paired with the food, if some time passes and the bell is presented again, the dog may start to salivate again even if the food is still not presented. So, because that memory is still there, it can get activated again. So, that is called spontaneous recovery. Now, Pavlov demonstrated that a conditioned response could generalize to similar stimuli. So, in many cases of classical conditioning, generalization could happen. For instance, he found that dog might respond to changes in the light when the light was used as a neutral stimulus. They do not it was not an original stimulus. In the context of children, reading on a parent's lap could generalize to reading across a room and eventually to reading independently and enjoying it. So, many times we learn in a particular context, then the things could generalize. So, like this generalization could happen in many cases. However, Pavlov also showed limits to generalization. It is not like it can be generalized to anything, there are limits to it. Dogs learn to discriminate between sounds associated with food and those that were not. This discrimination meant that they would only salivate to specific food sound. So, in many cases the discrimination was also observed in case of classical conditioning, particularly how Pavlov also observed. Only when sound associated with certain food or when it was food similar sound, they could kind of produce saliva, but not in many times they learn to discriminate with other kind of sound. So, discrimination was also evident in some cases. So, it is possible depending on the context, generalization could also happen, but there is a limit to generalization. The many times animals or human beings could also discriminate. So, additionally Pavlov also demonstrated that conditioning could be reversed also sometimes. So, if conditioning has happened, we can do the opposite of it, unconditioning can also be done, because it is a learned response. So, again this learned response can be unlearned also. So, the idea is if a conditioned stimuli like a light or a sound is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus, that is food, the conditioned response diminishes and eventually ceases. The process is known as extinction. So, basically it is an unlearning process. Extinction basically says that we can unlearn also when some pairing is not done after repeatedly, then we can forget about that also. So, extinction shows that we can, whatever conditioning has happened, we can unlearn that also. Now there are lot of limitations to classical conditioning. It is not that you can condition anything with anything. So, there are certain limitations. Modern research indicates that classical conditioning is not so straightforward as Pavlov has found in the case of dog in certain situations. It may not be so straightforward in every cases. While Pavlov believed that conditioning principles were general rules applicable to all animals, it is now understandable that different organisms are more easily conditioned to respond in a particular ways to specific stimuli. Now, conditioning limitation of conditioning here basically means that it is not equally easy to condition with anything. Certain stimulus it is easy to condition for certain animals, and it may not be so easy to condition similar thing with another animal. So, there are certain inbuilt differences between let us say humans and also within animals. So, similar kind of conditioning may not be possible with every animal or with every stimulus. So, there are certain limitations to that also, because there are individual differences even within animals, even with, and also obviously with the humans. For instance, a hungry dog can be conditioned to salivate with a bell that is paired with the sight and smell of meat. So, because when the dog is very hungry, at that time conditioning could be much strongly done as compared to let us say dog is satiated. So, a hungry dog will immediately respond to a food and those kind of thing. So, what is its condition and those kind of thing also could influence those kind of conditioning, can be influenced by that also. However, each species and even each individuals within the species has certain tendencies. So, all these tendencies differ from individual to individual, animal to animal. Even within the same animal, not every dog is same or every rat is same. So, they also have individual differences and tendencies which can either facilitate or hinder in terms of learning a new response. For example, humans tends to rely more on visual cues than smells, and different people have varied perceptual and aesthetic inclination. So, in case of humans, for example, we may be more easily conditioned by a visual stimulus than as compared to let us say smell related stimulus, and then also there are individual differences. Some people there are varied perceptual aesthetic differences. So, some people like something more. So, if that is used as an unconditioned stimulus, they are more likely to learn it faster as compared to another person may not like that. So, the conditioning cannot be done similarly with that person. So, despite all these complexities, classical conditioning still remains a very important explanations of learning responses in certain conditions, particularly where there is a strong natural pairing of stimulus and automatic response. So, if you see here, classical conditioning is mostly done in cases where the response is very automatic and then something new is paired with that. So, that is the typical case of classical conditioning. So, response has to occur automatically, then something else is added to that or paired with that, and then that new thing gets newer qualities in terms of that also stimulates a new response. So, lot of this so that's the case of classical conditioning. Now, how this concept of classical conditioning is connected to the concept of personality. Now, we have understood this whole paradigm of classical conditioning, because it is a theory, this particular course is related to personality. How do you relate personality with this particular paradigm? So, this Pavlov work with classical conditioning has a very important implications for understanding personality, particularly emotional reactions. As we have seen, classical conditioning can explain lot of emotional reactions that human being display. So, and emotion is also important part of personality. So, at least in that context, classical conditioning can explain a lot of aspect of personality, including emotional reactions. For example, one might be anxious not because of an inherent neurotic personality, but because they learn to be anxious through past experience. So, the explanation is very different in case of behavioral paradigm or classical conditioning as compared to other theories. A trait theory always tries to find answer within the individual. So, if the person has a particular characteristics, then they are showing this behavior, or let us say anxious behavior. But behaviorist, they try to explain let us say something like anxiety or anxious behavior, not because of the person is anxious, but because it has to do with some past conditioning. The person might have learned this anxiety because of its association with many other anxiety situations. So, person might develop an anxiety reactions, person is more likely to develop an anxiety reaction if because of his past experiences which led to classical conditioning of fear responses or anxiety reactions. So, they always try to explain using what is there in the from the environmental learning and not the traits or characteristics within the person. So, that is a typical characteristics of behaviorist explanation. So, this means that anxiety as a learned response can be also unlearned or extinguished. So, according to classical conditioning, whatever is learned can be also unlearned, So, it suggests that emotional reactions such as anxiety are not fixed part of our personality, but conditioned response that can be potentially altered. So, if anxieties are as a learned response, we can unlearn them also by using the same opposite principles. So, we will be talking about few things later. This insight became highly influential in psychology, which provided lot of therapeutic interventions from the behavioral perspectives. So, a lot of therapies actually were developed from based on classical conditioning, which they try to treat anxieties and other reactions, because if these are learned by certain experiences, they can also be unlearned by doing the some opposite unlearning process. One of the typical case which shows anxiety could be learned, it was also again shown by Pavlov in another experimental setup with the dog itself again, which is called as an experimental neurosis. So, behaviorism, particularly illustrated by Pavlov's work, offers insight into understanding certain personality dimension like neuroticism. So, it is a trait theory term, neuroticism, which means the persons who are high in the neuroticism are basically people who are more anxious, emotional instability and more emotional strong reactions happens within those individuals. So, behaviorist will not explain it is a part of or it is a characteristics of within the person, but rather say they might have learned it. So, that is the explanation is how it differs here. How this particular trait could come into existence through learning. Pavlov even showed that through an experiment, obviously it was with the animal. So, this is a paradigm called experimental neurosis. So, Pavlov experiment conditioning a response similar to neurotic behavior in a dog demonstrated that neuroticism may be conditioned response. So, he showed similar to anxiety or neurotic kind of personality behavior, he showed it through the experiment that animal could also show this kind of behaviors because of certain learning situation. So, why not human beings also learn similar thing? We do not have to explain using some internal traits or something like that. So, what was the experiment here? So, initially this is again typical conditioning experiment, this which was done again with the dog. Pavlov trained a dog to associate the presentation of food with a specific shape, here it is a circle. So, the circle is a conditioned stimulus, or initially it was a neutral stimulus, then it became a conditioned stimulus because it was associated with food, was consistently paired with food, which is an unconditional stimulus, causing dog to salivate in response to the presentation of a circle. Okay. So, in the earlier experimental setup, sound of bell was the neutral stimulus. Here, presentation of a circle in the screen. So, there was a screen which project certain figures. So, here when circle was presented, a dog was given food. So, dog learned a new response that whenever circle comes in the screen, dog is the dog is presented with the food. So, saliva was produced. Okay. So, saliva was conditioned or stimulated in the dog's mouth. So, it is a very similar experiment, only the here bell was replaced with circle. Okay. So, the dog learned a new response, that is whenever circle is presented, the dog saliva was produced in the mouth of dog. However, a new variation in that experiment was done. What was that? That an ellipse shape. So, it is not completely circular, but little bit like flat circle. Another shape was presented without food. So, when ellipse was presented, the dog was not given food, but when circle was presented, dog was given food. So, the dog learned to discriminate initially, that when circle comes, food is gone. So, automatically presentation of circle led to the production of saliva, but when ellipse figure was presented, the dog saliva was not produced. So, this was typical conditioning experiment. Now, what happened after the dog had reliably learned to salivate in response to the circle and not to the ellipse? Pavlov introduced a variation in the shape. So, he did something more tricky thing here. What he did? He gradually made the ellipse more circular. So, he slowly that ellipse, because it was presented, so he could change the shape. So, ellipse was slowly made into more circular. So, what is happening? The confusion was created in the mind of dog. How to respond? Because the dog initially learned it should not salivate in the response to, it was not paired with the food in ellipse, but that ellipse was slowly becoming circular. But in circle, it was supposed to get food, and it learned to respond with production of saliva. So, what is happening here? The confusion was created here. So, he gradually made the ellipse more circular, incrementally reducing the difference between the ellipse and the circle. This manipulation created ambiguity and the shapes became harder to distinguish. Now, the dog was not able to distinguish which one is what. So, there was a confusion in the mind of dog, which led to neurosis like anxiety like response in the dog. So, what is happening? As the distinction between the circle which was associated with food and the ellipse which was not associated with the food became less clear, both were almost becoming same, because the ellipse was becoming circular. The dog started experiencing difficulty in differentiating between the two shapes. Now, it was becoming difficult for the dog to differentiate between them. The dog began to show signs of confusion and anxiety. This state of confusion and heightened emotional distress was evident, and he termed it as an experimental neurosis by Pavlov. So, the dog exhibits behavior such as restlessness, whimpering and increase of agitation, which were very similar to anxiety and neurosis symptoms that we experience as a human being. So, here is just shown in a figure. So, in the circular shape, the dog is supposed to get food, and so dog was approaching towards the circular figure, but ellipse the dog ran away because it was not kind of associated with this. But when this ellipse become more and more circular, the dog was confused whether to approach or whether to run away and so on. So, like that he was, and the behavioral response were very similar to the anxiety response that we show as a human being. So, the Pavlov showed that through experimental condition that even things like anxiety situation could be learned response, and it is typically shown in this experiment by the even animal like dog could learn it. So, the similar thing is also possible in case of human beings. So, we can explain anxiety using or trait like neuroticism using classical conditioning paradigm. So, this experiment hints that neuroticism may be a conditioned response shaped by environmental stimuli that necessitates individuals to make judgments under conditions where differentiation is nearly impossible. So, this kind of where differentiation of things are becoming difficult, more confusing and ambiguous situation may lead to anxiety reactions, and person may learn if such situations are encountered again and again, the person may develop certain kind of trait like anxiety or neuroticism. For instance, children growing up in an unpredictable environment with unstable parents may experience difficulty predicting their parents' reaction. Let us say this is a situation of human life. If a child is grown in an unpredictable environment where they do not know which reaction will cause what kind of response, let us say the parents' reactions are very unstable, and children is not able to predict if I behave in this way what kind of response will come. If such situation one grows up, so it is possible that the children will feel very anxious and depressed, and those characteristics may be displayed by the children in the adulthood also. Because of this uncertainty whether expect praise or punishment consistently, so there is no predictable environment in which a child grows. Such unpredictability may create more anxiety within the child and so on, which may shape adult personality. So, this indicates that neuroticism, like other aspect of personality, may be influenced by environmental conditioning, which is the fundamental principle of behaviorism. So, it is a kind of experimental ways of proving that a lot of personality traits could be a learned trait. From the environment we learn something and it develops as a pattern, it need not be explained through internal traits and conflicts and so on. Now, John B. Watson, who actually properly tried to develop this whole school of behaviorism, and he is also called as father of behaviorism. Pavlov was a Russian, because obviously the Pavlov experiment gave the foundation for behaviorism, and Watson, John J. B. Watson was very impressed by the findings of Pavlov, and he tried to kind of give more proper shape to the whole behaviorist concept. So, John B. Watson was an American psychologist. He greatly influenced by the Pavlov's early work and applied Pavlov's observational techniques in his own research and replicated some of these findings in the United States. Watson also advocated a shift in American psychology towards becoming a true science by rejecting introspective method used by Freud and other psychoanalysts, which he called them as unscientific methodology. So, that was the main argument, that lot of methodologies used by psychoanalysis are unscientific, because these are mostly case studies, and he was impressed by Pavlov's experiments, and he used replicated a lot of this finding in the America also. And Watson argued that focus on observational behavior, observable behavior which we can observe and measure, and the effects of stimuli using rigorous scientific method primarily in the laboratory setting to collect data should be the prime objectives of psychologists. He published all his views in 1914, a book called Behavior, and further elaborated in Psychology from the Standpoint of Behaviorist in 1999. So, these are his books which introduced Pavlov's work to broader audience and gave the foundation for the whole school of behaviorism. So, Watson is credited with founding the school of behaviorism, which was again then extended by other people that we will talk about in the next lecture. Although his career in psychology was not very long, he ended his psychology career in 1920, and he left academics and went into business and so on. But still he kind of initially gave foundational work of behaviorism in terms of giving a shape to the school. So, Watson is mainly known for an experiment called Little Albert experiment. So, what he did with his child. So, Watson is known for this experiment, which he conducted with one of his graduate student, Rosalie Reiner, in 1920. In this experiment, an 11-month-old child named Albert was conditioned to fear a white rat. So, this was a typical experiment of Pavlov's experiment. He did it with a small child. So, obviously, at that time lot of ethical issues were not that strongly followed at that time. Obviously, such experiment will not be possible in today's world, where you you do an experiment and the child learns to fear. So, because this is harmful for that child, it will not be allowed in today's situation, but at that time he did it. So, that was an 11-month old child. He conditioned that child to fear rat, white rat. So, child was not afraid of fear rat, white rat or any kind of rats, but through conditioning this whole experiment or paradigm, they developed a new, tried to create a new response in that child, that is to fear the white rat. Initially, Albert showed no fear of the rat. So, it was a neutral stimulus for this particular child. He was not afraid of white rat, So, it is a neutral response. White rat was not creating any response or any kind of fear response. However, Watson and his student Renner, what he did, that paired the presentation of rat with a loud frightening noise, which is an unconditional stimulus, because it created a fear response in that child, which naturally caused Albert to cry, which is an unconditioned response. So, obviously, if you produce a very loud and disturbing sound to a child or an infant, it will cry, it will, because it will be afraid of that sound. So, and what they did, they paired this unconditioned response or stimulus with the neutral stimulus, that is white rat here. So, after several pairing, what they did, so the whenever this white rat was presented to the child, immediately a loud sound was produced. So, this pairing was done again and again, and loud noise created fear and child started crying. So, after this several pairing, Albert began to cry just at the sight of the rat, which is conditioned stimulus, demonstrating that fear could be conditioned in humans. So, the earlier child was not afraid of white rat, but when this white rat was presented with a loud sound, which created fear, and the child started crying. Now, whenever this white rat was produced without this sound also, the child started crying. So, the child learned to fear this particular white rat. So, it is a conditioned new learned response. So, they demonstrated that fear could be also learned. This experiment also showed generalization. Now, this little Albert began to show fear responses to other white objects, like other furry objects similar to white rat, like dolls and other things which are white furry objects. So, generalization also happened in this particular case of experiment. So, obviously, this experiment obviously will not be ethically allowed in today's scenario, but this experiment shows that fear could be learned also through this experiment. Now, behavior therapy also became quite prominent, based on classical conditioning and other thing. Many psychologists, classical conditioning of emotional reaction became very crucial in understanding development of psychopathology, and lot of changes in terms of therapy also. People started developing therapies based on this classical conditioning, because if emotions are learned, they can be unlearned also, particularly the negative or emotions like fear, anxiety and so on. So, behavior therapy based on classical conditioning focused on extinguishing problematic responses such as conditioned fear, or conditioning new more desirable response to stimuli that elicit unwanted reaction like anxiety. So, problematic emotional reactions they tried to cure using behavior therapy which are based on classical conditioning. For example, one of the earlier such therapy was done by Mary Covert Jones in 1924. She conducted one of the first systematic behavior therapy experiment aiming to remove fear response in a boy named Peter, who was 2 years 10 months old. So, Watson created fear in little Albert. So, Mary Covert Jones did the opposite. So, there was a boy named Peter who had similar fear, because this boy had already natural fear was there, it was not created. So, she tried to, Mary Covert Jones, she tried to remove that fear condition from that boy using just the similar principle, but just in opposite ways. So, Peter, had a very similar symptoms which was created by Watson in the little Albert. He was a generally healthy boy and well adjusted, but had an exaggerated fear for white rat. Now, this boy had otherwise is a normal boy, but it had an exaggerated too much fear for white rat, which extended to other white and furry objects like rabbit, fur coat, feather and cotton wool. This fear was similar to the fear response of little Albert that was actually created. Little Albert was completely healthy and had no fear, but it was created in the case of little Albert, but in the case of Peter it was already there naturally. So, she tried to remove those fear. So, that was the difference. So, Jones meticulously documented Peter's fear response and the conditions that elicited the greatest fear. So, she tried to meticulously find out what caused fear and which condition created the highest fear, and all these details she studied about the child. She then aimed to uncondition Peter's fear response to the rabbit and observe this uncondition would generalize to other stimuli. So, she tried to remove that. So, how did she basically did? Jones brought Peter to play while the rabbit was present alongside the other children who were not afraid of the rabbit. So, slowly the Peter was exposed to white rabbit slowly in a more controlled condition in a play like situation where there were other children who were playing with that white rabbit and they were not afraid of. So, the Peter slowly looked at those behavior of other children and slowly it learned unlearned those fear responses. So, gradually Peter's fear diminished because of exposure to those situations where rabbit was not feared by other individuals, including he himself, slowly exposed to those white rabbit. So, this fear response diminished and he moved from almost complete terror at the sight of rabbit to a complete positive response. So, before the experiment, the Peter had almost terrorizing experience by seeing white rabbit, but when it was slowly unconditioned, a new response created within the Peter, that this whole fear was completely vanished. Mary Covert Jones observed that after successfully unconditioning the Peter's fear of the rabbit, he also lost fear of fur coat, feathers and cotton wool, which were part of that original fear conditioning. This generalization of the unconditioned response to other stimuli indicated that procedure was effective even without understanding the origin of Peter's fears. So, they said a lot of other theories try to find causes and too many complex explanations. So, here without even going into all the detailed causes and explanations, simple classical conditioning or unlearning principle, counter conditioning became an effective procedure without going into all the complex explanation. It worked. So, that is what is important. So, this study marked a significant early use of behavior therapy to treat conditioned fear, demonstrating that this classical conditioning principle could change behavior positively. Another particular technique which is very popular is called systematic desensitization, which is also part of behavior therapy, which is applied again with using the similar principles of unlearning proposed by Joseph Olpe. Joseph Olpe was a South African psychiatrist. He was very influenced by Pavlov's work. Olpe considered persistent anxiety reaction as a learned response that could be unlearned through therapy. So, systematic desensitization, Olpe's therapeutic technique aims to inhibit anxiety through counter conditioning. So, whenever any particular stimulus causes anxiety, we can counter conditioning it using systematic desensitizations, which could be done even imagining also, or it could be done in the real situation where you move slowly towards the stimuli, and at the same time whenever anxiety happens, you produce an opposite reaction to the opposite of anxiety, that is relaxation. So, anxiety is replaced with relaxation through counter conditioning. So, I will not go into the details of these things because that is not the point of this lecture. So, in what happens in counter conditioning, an individual learns a new response that is physiologically incompatible with existing anxiety or fear response. So, incompatible response of stress or anxiety is relaxation. So, whenever one is in the relaxed state, you cannot be anxious, or when you are anxious, you cannot be relaxed. So, these are opposite incompatible states. So, what happens in systematic desensitization, whenever you experience anxiety because of certain situations or certain stimuli, then you produce or induce a relaxed state. So, anxiety is replaced with relaxation. So, if you are relaxed, anxiety cannot remain together. So, this is how the goal is to learn a new response such as relaxation to the feared stimuli, whatever stimuli that one is feared of. People have exaggerated fear and anxiety of so many things. So, whenever such anxiety reaction happens, it is replaced with learning relaxation techniques. So, these are elaborate things that he developed. Through new classical conditioning experiences, an individual is taught to experience relaxation instead of fear when exposed to those stimuli. So, that is called counter conditioning. So, it was anxiety was kind of conditioned, now it is counter conditioned with relaxation. So, once this new response is established, the individual's fear is expected to be eliminated. This technique has become a cornerstone of behavior therapy, particularly for treating anxiety and so on. Now, this classical conditioning, for some time interest in classical conditioning declined because of later cognitive psychology and so many other new paradigm came up. So, after 40s and 50s, for some time interest in a lot of behavioral things actually diminished, and but slowly again resurgence in recognizing the importance, or slowly it emerged again in 90s and in earlier 2000. Some more research actually started, renewed interest happened in classical conditioning. One area where it also showed more application, like unconscious development of fears and attitudes. Lot of attitude that we develop in terms of certain judgment about things and peoples could also be classically conditioning. Some experiment shows. Research has demonstrated that classical conditioning can be also used to show how people unconsciously develop fears and attitude towards others. For example, some of the studies by Krosnick and colleagues have shown that subliminal presentation of stimuli with positive or negative emotional value can influence attitude towards the stimuli. For example, if a photo is subliminally associated with negative emotions, people will unconsciously develop dislike for that photo, and vice versa for the positive association. So, subliminal presentation means whenever you present, let us say project a photo on the screen, and you ask people to look at those photos, and then whether you are asked to rate whether to what extent you like about this photo and dislike about that photo. So, it was found that when it was very subliminally, means very short period of time, person may not even notice that certain negative emotions are associated with certain stimuli. Whatever stimuli is present, and then person is required to rate the liking and disliking about that stimuli, and then with that stimuli, if they also subliminally present some emotional content, or let us say some positive emotional, some pictures with some positive emotions or negative emotions, which could be so fastly present subliminally that person may not even notice, and then this kind of stimuli, whatever stimuli you present, maybe a neutral phase or something like that. So, it was found that when subliminally, when such a stimuli is presented with a negative emotional object, then people automatically develop disliking for that photo, which objectively should not have any reason for disliking, simply because it was subliminally associated with negative emotions, or the vice versa. When people start liking about a particular stimuli, when it was subliminally paired with a positive emotion, anything that stimulate positive emotions. So, at the such deeper level, at the unconscious level also, when something is paired with positive and negative emotions, people may develop liking and disliking without consciously thinking about it. So, that is something called as an unconscious development. So, a lot of these fears and lot of attitude and liking and disliking about people could also be developed by this classical conditioning. just one thing, something has got associated with this person and you start developing disliking about that person. So many such kind of things could influence by association. So, a lot of these attitudes and prejudice that people show could also be classically conditioned. So, this line of research suggests that many of our attitudes and preferences could be classically conditioned on a subliminal or unconscious basis. Social psychologist Cacioppo conducted that aversive stimuli prejudices once created may be difficult to eliminate consciously. People can have egalitarian beliefs about something and still display prejudicial behavior in certain situation due to conditioned aversive reaction learned early in childhood. So, we might have learned a lot of liking and disliking about so many aspects. It could be about some communities, some people, it could be about some regions of a country, whatever it is. We develop certain emotions associated with those objects, and even though you become a highly intellectual and consciously you have a very secular views or egalitarian views about something, but still those emotions that were developed earlier could influence your attitude. You may have subtle disliking about some things, some people, some communities, simply because those emotions were associated with that. So, it is possible that lot of these attitudes and preferences and prejudices that we develop about lot of objects and peoples and communities could be classically conditioned. So, this implies that non-prejudicial attitudes, even though you in your conscious thought processes you are not biased, but there can be very strong conditioned emotional reactions towards the same objects, which may influence your actual behavior. In your thoughts, in your speaking, you may not say that, but when behavior comes, you may actually show those biased behaviors simply because of those classical conditioning things. Sometimes our self-esteem, our sense of self-worthiness could also be classical conditioning when it can be influenced by certain classical conditioning, because self-esteem could also change. There may be some stability around it, but still self-esteem could change, but those changes could also be sometimes through classical conditioning. So, some research also link classical conditioning principle to self-esteem. For example, Backus and colleagues hypothesized that expression of high self-esteem could be influenced through classical conditioning. So, they did what they did. Participant engaged in conditioning task where self-relevant words appeared on a computer screen alongside a picture of smiling people. Okay. So, some self-relevant word, for example, some word about yourself, whatever, certain statements were projected on the screen, along with certain emotional faces were also projected. Now, this experimental condition, in one condition, the intent, the words or statements were paired with positive emotions with the self. In the control condition, in another condition, participants self-relevant words were paired with mix of smiling, frowning and neutral faces. So, what kind of faces which generate certain emotions within us were associated with certain self-relevant words by which you describe yourself, it impacted about your own judgment about yourselves, which is self-esteem. So, results show that after completing the task, participant self-esteem was actually measured before and after the experiment. The result shows that participant exposed to experimental condition where self-relevant words were consistently paired with smiling faces. So, when some self-related words were presented with smiling faces, so smiling faces evoke positive emotions, it enhanced self-esteem of those participants, displayed higher level of self-esteem compared to those in the control condition where it was mixed. Sometimes frowning faces, sometimes negative faces were presented. So, comparatively both the groups before and after, the self-esteem actually was much better in case of experimental condition where smiling face was associated with self-related words. The effect was observed both in overall participant group and subgroups categorized by pre-experimental self-esteem levels, indicating that classical conditioning can enhance or decrease self-esteem also. So, it is possible many times our own concept of self-esteem, the level of self-esteem could also be influenced by a lot of classical conditioning that happens in around our life in various settings of our life. So, classical conditioning has many implications towards our personality, our emotions, and so it developed from the animal model, but it has a lot of application in the human life as well. So, with this I will stop here. In the next class we will be talking about another behavioral paradigm which is called operant conditioning, and how it is different from classical conditioning. We will discuss all these details in the next class. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.